Thanks again to everyone for attending tonight's session, part of our global conference on multilateralism to celebrate 20 years of IDDRI. You're here in the session 2, titled Sustainability as a Motor for Renewal. And the session is chaired by Marie-Laure Salle, the director at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. We're very honored to have Marie-Laure today. I think I will now give the floor to Marie-Laure and thank her again for agreeing to chair that session. But before, let me just, in 1 minute, remind everyone that this session will last 1 hour and 30 minutes. There will be 1 hour of exchanges between our distinguished speakers, followed by 30 minutes of Q&A at the end. If you have any question during any of the remarks given by our speakers, feel free to send any question in the right of your screen. You should see some dedicated space to ask questions to the speakers, and these will be taken up in the final Q&A session and the last 30 minutes. Thank you very much. Let me now give the floor to Marie-Laure Salle, and thanks again to our distinguished speakers for agreeing to join us tonight.
Thank you very much, Lola. Thank you very much, Karine, and all the IDDRI team for organizing this and for having me in this role today. Delighted to be here with such a wonderful panel on such an important topic. So let me start actually by trying to frame a bit the way in which I'm reading the title for this session, and then I will turn to each of our panelists in turn with a number of questions. In 1992, Ulrich Beck published a book with the evocative title, Risk Society Towards a New Modernity. Arguably, the last few years have taught us that we live, in fact, in a society of uncertainty, of radical uncertainty, possibly, even more than in a society of risk. I'm using here, obviously, the classic distinction made by Frank Knight already in 1921 between the two notions. According to Knight, risk refers to a situation in which the probability of an outcome can be determined and therefore the outcome possibly insured against. Uncertainty, by contrast, refers to an event whose probability cannot be known at all, hence it is essentially unpredictable. The unknown unknown, the famous unknown unknown. One reason for this kind of radical uncertainty in the contemporary world is extreme complexity and hence the impossibility to map the consequences of interplays between multiplicities of actors and factors. In our world, complexity and hence uncertainty emerge from various dynamics of entropy that furthermore interconnect. One such negative spiral is the one obviously associated with our environment, climate, resources and biodiversity all included. A second one is social and economic and stems from the cancerous impact of deepening inequalities. A third one is informational and political and derives in part from the fragmentation power of digital technologies. Finally, obviously, COVID-19 has added a fifth layer of anthropic spiral into this pool, creating interconnected dynamics that can only lead to deeply unexpected and unmeasurable consequences, and therefore to radical uncertainty. All these interconnected dynamics of entropy, we need to note, have a transnational scope and reach. And they become deeper and more interconnected precisely at a time in our collective history where we are entering a cycle of weakening of the transnational multilateral institutions that were built in and for the American century. What causes what here is in part unclear, but the reality is that we have a correlation, at least increasingly complex and hence uncertain dynamics playing out more and more at the transnational global level happen to co-evolve with the weakening of our multilateral architecture and system. Multilateralism is being questioned, sometimes even threatened, at a time when interdependencies have never been so acute and therefore so much calling, in fact, urgently for effective international collaboration and joint mobilization. The trends that fuel complexity and uncertainty, which I mentioned above, so environmental disruption, social inequalities, and informational fragmentation, with a spiraling into the fragilization of democracy, all carry seeds of unsustainability. A spoiled environment, a disrupted climate, and the rapid destruction of essential natural resources compromise the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, which, according to the Brundtland report, is the very definition of unsustainability. The social, economic, political, and geopolitical fragmentation to an extreme of our societies, which the other two trends carry, makes it difficult to see how we can live together in a safe and secure way, carrying instead the threat of violence, conflicts, wars, and destructions. So unsustainability seems to be the direction towards which we are headed, if nothing changes. So is this indeed where we are going? Is there maybe an alternative, one that would imply that we start from where we want to end, a sustainable world, one that does not compromise the ability of future generations to meet their own needs? And from this endpoint that we would give ourselves as target, we would then have to reinvent institutional and organizational systems, as well as probably have to engage into a value and paradigm shift that would make such a project possible. That is how I believe we can understand the title of this session, Sustainability as a Lever for Renewal. Start from the endpoint, what should be our ultimate objective, sustainability, and turn this endpoint, this projected objective, into a motor for the renewal of our systems, values, organizational and institutional dynamics. And do that in particular for a system that is currently in dire straits, even though it has never been as needed as today, the multilateral system. How do we do this? This is exactly, I think, what we will be discussing in the coming hour and a half. Let me just here underscore at this stage only some general threads and ideas. Probably before anything else, we need new valuation mechanisms and indicators to serve as a structuring compass for our multilateral system. The same, in fact, by the way, applies to our nations, to our companies, even to our school systems. We need to move away from a unidimensional and somewhat fetishist focus on economic growth as the definition of value creation and the good life to multidimensional indicators and hence compass. Let us start maybe by taking SDGs and their systemic interactions seriously and bringing them at the core of all multilateral institutions and their defining raison d'être. Just doing that would require the profound realignment of many of those institutions. Sustainability needs to be infused at the core and not just as a mere afterthought or communication ploy. Another key challenge is that of legitimacy that cannot be decoupled from inclusion. How do we retool a post-World War II winner-take-it-all system to turn it into a seriously inclusive and therefore legitimate platform for exchange and concrete collaboration? One way in which to move in that direction is to frame issues and questions much more systematically in ways that underscore tragedy of the commons dynamics over the zero-sum game, and pushing for collaborative solutions rather than all-out competition. Finally, it would seem that subsidiarity and layered dynamics of multilateralism might be a trend that significantly improves legitimacy and hence trust and effectiveness. Those are just some very general points of reflection and directions, and the different contributions that will follow will naturally enrich and expand well beyond. So we're very lucky today to have around the table four very distinguished scholars, Professor Emel Parlardal, who is a professor of international relations at Marmara University. Then we have Professor Maria Ivanova, who is Professor of Global Governance, Director of the PhD and MA programs in Global Governance and Human Security, and Director of the Center for Governance and Sustainability at UMass Boston. We have Professor Bertrand Badi, who is Emeritus Professor at Sciences Po and Associate Researcher to the CERI, very well well-known, world-renowned expert in international relations that probably we don't need to present here. And finally, Susanne Droge, who is Senior Fellow at the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik. So allow me to start with Professor Emel Ballardal. Emel, my first question to you is about the notion that you mobilize of minilateralism. Can you tell us what you mean by that? What is this concept and how do you mobilize it?
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to this workshop on such an important topic. I prepared a very short presentation based on the questions that you but if you want, I can answer your questions by one. It depends on you. However, first of all, I will start by responding to your first question. What is minilateralism and how it contributes to multilateralism? Because we have been talking about the crisis of multilateralism in the last few years. And then we also try to understand how international affairs are evolving, and how minilateralism can limit multilateralism, or how it can contribute to multilateralism. First of all, I think that minilateralism may complement multilateralism if the members of minilateral coalition remain committed to the general principles of multilateralism. However, in some cases, multilateralism lacks effective mechanisms to absorb rising and middle powers, and it has become thinner in recent years, especially under previous Trump administration. In this context, rising powers and middle powers have constantly and with very limited success asked for larger representation in formal international organization, and they also ask for larger quotas and voting shares in these institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. In their guess for legitimacy in the context of contested legitimacy of these existing international organizations, rising powers may shift to alternative, less crowded institutions like the G20, or even create new institutions like AIIB. But these alternative and newly created institutions may still suffer from input legitimacy deficit and fail to contribute to raise rising power status in the international system. I think that minilateralism is not an obstacle to multilateralism. In contrast, it can strengthen multilateralism in case it becomes inclusive. What does this mean? This means that it can be used as a means of reconciling and can serve in closing the gap between the competing positions and in moving the negotiations forward. In face of global challenges, like international climate policy, for example, minilateralism can offer great potential, but also it has some limitations. Ad hoc alliances might not necessarily be able to eliminate the structural barriers to an ambitious international treaty. However, they may act as a platform for political dialogue and improve cooperation among states for multilateral negotiations. On the other hand, ad hoc alliances as outputs of minilateralism may generate benefits for their members that reduce the risk of free riding and contribute to a legitimization of international organizations, certain policies and regimes. Similarly, BRICS meetings, for instance, or other mini-summits organized alongside G20 summit as side events can also help leaders of the member countries find solutions to their bilateral problems. On the other hand, I must also remind that informality is on the rise since 1990s. Do you hear me? Okay. On the other hand, I must also remind that informality is on the rise, especially since 1990s. And the complex and multi-stakeholder and multi-sectoral nature of global governance has finally led to an increasing morphing from formal and rigid forms of global governance to more informal, networked, and flexible modes of global governance, especially since the end of 19th and the beginning of 2000s. This ongoing trend towards informal networked models of governance has been accentuated with the rise of emerging powers to the international stage who are generally attached to the principle of sovereignty and equity in global governance. Rising powers in their quest for expanded influence and upgraded status in the international system have initially sought to increase their engagement in formal international governmental organizations such as United Nations Security Council, the World Bank, World Trade Organization, and IMF. Since a higher profile in these formal international organizations was considered as a reflection of emerging powers, growing power in key international issues, this cluster of countries until recently paid very little attention to less formalized modes of global governance. However, the failure of formal international organizations to equally adapt to the global shift of power from the global north to the global south in the last decade through increasing rising powers, voting shares, and representativeness in these institutions has resulted in the increasing turn-away of the latter from formal international organizations and in their growing interest in alternative and informal platforms of global governance such as G20, BRICS, and MICTA groups. On the other hand, within the context of international trading system, minilateralism is needed, since bilateral and regional treaties seem to be beneficial in some cases. However, they can also result in some problems, because developing countries can have less power vis-a-vis measure powers in bilateral negotiations more specifically, and this may weaken their maneuvering power. In short, whether minilateralism becomes beneficial for multilateralism depends on the nature of power relations among states and the issue areas in which they are negotiating. In conclusion, as a response to your second question in the paper, I can say that the commitment of political leadership to multilateralism is needed, but not only at discursive level, but also at practical level. Multilateralism can only be saved if the developing world or southern countries remain attached to its core values. This clearly shows that minilateralism is an option in need, but it is still not l'ordre du jour. It is a complementing mode of governance. It cannot replace multilateralism, since its effectiveness is highly dependent upon the degree of commitment of rising and middle powers to multilateral rules. For instance, although China is challenging the multilateral order in some policy areas, it is still committed to multilateral order in principle and acts actively in formal international institutions. Yes, for enhanced status in international politics, especially in the field of development, rising powers are making efforts to demonstrate their positive distinctiveness from the hierarchical system that elevates traditional donors by excelling in defining development cooperation. I'm giving this as an example. This can be recourse to unilateralism. Yet, their ability to raise their status mostly depends on their commitment to multilateral development system. In this vein, the use of multilateral aid channels rather than bilateral ones can strengthen both the legitimacy of rising powers development cooperation policies and their status seeking through social creativity in the realm of international development. In short, the inclusive form of minilateralism is always needed to have an effective multilateralism. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Emel. May I just have one question on one further question on the limitations dimension, particularly on the risk of fragmentation, whether you see this as a possible limitation or whether this is not so?
I don't see unilateralism as a real limitation, but of course it has some limitations. As I said in the conclusion of my short presentation, it depends on the policy issues, and it depends on the power, the type of power relations among states. If the rising power or the emerging power has is very dependent on the measured power in other issue areas, this can make the things much more difficult, and then this can also make the unilateral dialogue unsuccessful. So this is very much dependent on the type of power relations among states, and also the coalition and the members of the coalition, and also the issue area. For example, in development cooperation, things are much more easier, but in another issue area like trade negotiations, minilateralism can create much more difficulties. So it depends on the policy issues, it depends on the dialogue between the states and the type of the coalition.
Much, Emel. This is indeed very helpful. So I will turn now to Professor Badier. Bertrand, I will start with the first question. In one of your last books, you tell us that the world is not geopolitical anymore. That's quite a provocative, claim in the context. So, can you tell us what you mean by that, and what are your arguments to propose this?
Yeah, thank you very much, and good evening to everybody. I'm sorry, but I made difficulties for hearing you. I hope that you don't have the same difficulty. But I could hear your question about my proposals on the energetics. We are presently a transition. That's to say, the international system, the present international system, as being a very important transition. I know that the has been in particle science, but I think that consider that we are moving from of security, international security, to another, as to say, from a national conception of security to security. The transition, because we were anchored in of national security during more than 4 centuries, and that's why Geneva is in a very world is a kind of mix between these two concepts. Security. By national security, I mean the territorial nation state, and security, I mean threats coming from the world system, and that the world system. That's to say, from the system when the national security was a nation state to another nation state, and this is of the main conditions of the system. Of course, national security is, but that it is an issue which is backed with global security. That it's impossible to national security without it. Global security. There is a real transformation of the national arena. That reasons the traditional power is no longer the metrics of international relation, and that geopolitics is over. Politics has different meanings and different definitions. The main point on which is based the geopolitics is that the concepts of power as the matrix of the international relation. Now, we have to move to another matrix, which is the global security. And global security is much more lethal than the all threats, and that insecurity. Insecurity is lethal. It's lethal as such, for instance, that starvation results in 9 or 10 million casualties, or that in about 8 million casualties per year, while, for instance, terrorism is resulting in 4 1,000 casualties per year. That's to say there is a real of global insecurity. But the main point, the most important point, is that security is lethal as such, also lethal as of the new international conflict. The traditional interstate war is when new conflicts are really rooted in the social transformation of the world, rooted in the global insecurity. That's to say, starvation, climate change, or economic crisis, food insecurity are the main factors of the new wars. And that's why I consider global insecurity is killing twice in the present world. That is implying something very important, that globality imply enemy or enmity, doesn't imply strategies, imply zero-sum game. But now moving, leading another game, which is the intersocial game. Intersocial relations are substituted to interstate relations, are much more relevant for understanding peace and war issues, traditional vision politics. That social facts, social acts, social relations are running decisions and political strategies. Why I suggest to substitute the concept of intersociality to the concept of interstate relations, which was content of international. What are social relations? There are social flows and climate change, economic crisis, food security, health and safety are social issues, and all relations and all social flows, social issues, social relations are framing the new international arena. And this is leading to a major contradiction, which is at the very center in the international relations. Contradiction. Our system, our international system was invented some 4 or 5 years ago around concepts. The fall of games are still by political origin. When the international system is framed and structured around the social and intersocial, and that and the world order is around an option, that's to say made of a gladiator, is made of an international public which is directly inspired by interstate relations, is also organized in international institutions which are clearly by the previous concert of nations. You can, of course, then at Versailles, the were negotiating around the concept of League of Nations, British Prime Minister George said that the League of Nations must be the continuation of the old and Court of Nations. Right now, we are facing multi, and I would say UNs. You have and which is by the Security Council, which is only one security, that national state security. Ignores the new concept of global security. So that the Russian Security Council was said in 20 that about counterproductive. That Security Council is the temple of citizen. While on the other hand, the institutions try to have a hold on new global issues, say health, security, and health security, and so on. The dynamics of the international institutions by now. It's in two fields: multilateralism. One with Kofi Annan, social multilateralism, which is really which has on global issues, and on the other hand, it's which is the difference of Security Council. I consider of the political group. The first axis is to consciousness of power, the Westphalian power. And we consider a new kind of power, which I would or global power, which is and to work on globalization. Work globalization, try to also get advantages from. This is global power. That's to say, this capacity control to take benefit from globalization. This is the new global power, which is constituted, which will be additional option power. The second axis, in exactly in the line drawn by Amal, that's to say, is the dealing with the new internal Westphalian system resulted in an oligarchic vision system. That's to say, this famous minilateralism. The first of this minilateralism was the nation was constituted by the 5 in Europe during the 19th century, and the last step of this minilateralism is 7 of G20, which does to a global issue, because global is global. Minilateralism is a contradiction globalism. And systemic are much more active explaining the international dynamics at single factors. That's to say, when we mention global security, global issues, we mean a package of different connected, which are interplaying themselves. That's to say, environment security, individual security. They are constantly interplaying. When in the Italian, the contrary, that's to say, the political factor was proeminent as a single factor. And the fourth point is that the new world order implies to grade the role of local actors. To say, we know that results in an upgrading localization. This is the localization. New international are certainly giving to local actors, but it is the same with the global issue. It's possible to deal with climate security, a great connect. All these issues are clearly connected to social structures and then are not entirely dependent on the state and rulers. So that's why I mentioned that we are moving geopolitics and inter relations, which is not only a new word.
Thank you very much, Bertrand. So, you know, one of the questions that I put to all of you at the beginning was, how do we fix multilateralism? And this is really the topic of today. And we hear actually two big tendencies already in the two first intervention. One is, in a sense, moving towards a more kind of a subsidiarity level, more inclusive mechanisms through minilateralism solution that is bringing us back closer to the specificity of issues and questions in particular groups of countries or particular regions or particular, assemblage of nation states. And the other trend, which I think comes clearly from, and some of this is also obviously underscored by Bertrand Badier, but and the other trend that comes in Bertrand Badier's talk is really this idea of embracing global issues, not from an international or interstate level, but really as global issues. And this is really something that I spent quite a bit of time insisting in my introduction on. So in a sense, this kind of a notion of born global issues and therefore necessity for born global solutions, that is a way to be more effective and more efficient. So it seems to me that there's both a tension between those two trends, but also some very strong degree of complementarity. So we'll see if Maria and Suzanne move us in other direction, or if they actually come to give more way to one or the other of those paths. So I will turn to Maria now, and Maria, can you maybe start by telling us why does cooperation on the environment would matter for the global South? I mean, isn't this a rich country's problems? Why should it matter for global South?
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me here today in this virtual conference room. And first of all, congratulations to IDDRI for the 20th anniversary. I have been privileged to participate in many of the IDDRI activities over the past 20 years, and I'm delighted to be here now to celebrate with such a dynamic discussion. I had a chance to follow also in the morning, and the debates are really profound and interesting, and there's just so much dynamism in the suggestions that are coming up. So let me actually start by saying, or starting off where Professor Bertrand Badier also kind of put things together of this reconceptualizing security. And you mentioned, Professor Badier, from national security to global security. And let me push that envelope a little bit and say, and from there to human security. How do we conceptualize the difference between global security and human security? As you mentioned in the introduction, I am a professor of global governance and also direct the PhD and the master's programs in global governance and human security at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. We started this program in 2012, is the first program on human security in the United States. And let me just give you the definition of human security. It is the ability of humans to lead healthy and productive lives in harmony with nature. And this, to me, is the epitome of sustainability. That's what we mean by sustainability, is the ability of humans to lead healthy and productive lives in harmony with nature. And indeed, that is both human security, security at the individual, at the personal level, and global security, as Professor Badier was saying. And so that national security concept was the in-between that is indeed, it's no longer adequate, it's no longer sufficient. So I would love to think through these two kind of ends of the concept, the human security and the global security, and see how do we connect them, and what kind of global institutions do we need to that effect. But so to your question, Marie-Laure, why does the global South need to be part of these negotiations, of these institutions of environmental multilateralism, is very simple. Because we're all inhabitants on this one planet that is so interconnected through environmental issues, through social issues, through security issues. Where are we right now? We are all grounded in a sense, and yet we're all interconnected because of a global pandemic that actually has its roots in environmental issues, in human impact on the environment. But so I just want to take a step back and think about the topic of today, which is multilateralism and fixing multilateralism. I'd love to come back in the discussion. What do we mean by fixing? What is broken that needs to be fixed? What would something that is fixed or that is unbroken look like? What are we fixing? Why does it need fixing? But I'll leave that for later. But multilateralism at its core is about relations that are about the indivisibility of interests, that we all share the same interests. It's also about a commitment to reciprocity. And it's also about a system for dispute settlement. So the institutions, in a sense, at the core, multilateralism is about common ground. It's about interconnectedness and solidarity, and it's about sound, solid institutions. And so I want to state for the record that the environment is that common ground. The environment is everything. We are within the environment. Our social system is within the environment. Our economic system is dependent on the environment. And so whether we are developed countries or developing countries or economies in transition, and that is where I originally come from. I was born and raised in Bulgaria, which was always a different category, right? Not developing, not developed, but the economy is in transition, and now we're part of the European Union, so we don't know, have we transitioned already? at the core of small, big states, powerful, less powerful, is that common ground, and that is the environment. But why developing countries, why the global south needs to be part of it and part of the institutions, and needs to not only respond to the rules, but be able to make the rules, is because the impacts affect us all, but some more than others. And there's the impact that we experience from global issues, but there's also the impact that we have on global issues. Whether we are a small island developing state will shape how we experience climate change and how we contribute to climate change, or whether we are a big industrialized country. And because of those impacts are different, they're differential, they also need to be, we have to respond differently because we have different needs. If we are a small island developing state responding to the impact of climate change, we have different needs: economic needs, social needs, political needs, and we have also different capabilities. Again, economic, social, communication capabilities. So I want us to think in multilateralism about the impacts, the different states, because multilateralism is still about the states and it's still about that interstate system that Professor Badier says we're over it, we have to get over it, and yet all of our institutions are based on that. But so we need to think about the impacts, we need to think about the needs, we need to think about the capabilities. And one last point I will make here is that developing countries, the global south, has been part of the multilateral system of negotiation since that system was created in the 1970s, as these countries also became part of the multilateral system as they gained independence. And so they joined the various multilateral environmental agreements. They became part of them and committed to certain obligations, and have actually performed to a large extent based on their needs and capabilities. What we have done at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, is create a new empirical tool, the Environmental Conventions Index, that actually measures to what extent all the countries that are part of these multilateral environmental agreements actually deliver on their commitments. To what extent do they implement the promises that they have made? And what we have discovered is a very counterintuitive and a positive story, that a lot of countries in the global south are actually doing what they are supposed to do. And so ultimately it is within the multilateral system that we can exert this, or that we could implement this strategy, not of naming and shaming, but of naming and acclaiming. Who is doing what they committed to do? Why? Where? How can others who are similar peer states or peers can do the same thing? For example, Indonesia, Rwanda, Gambia are performing on several of the agreements. There is not one single country in the world, developing or developed, that does equally well on all of the multilateral environmental agreements. So to be named and acclaimed, developing countries need to be part of the system. They need to know what is happening, and they need to be able to stand up with confidence in the multilateral system and negotiate and continue to improve their implementation. I'll stop here.
Thank you very, very much, Maria. I was going to ask you one more question, but we have little time for it. So you'll tell me whether you want to take it or whether you want to keep it rather for the end. And, you know, the question is what needs to be fixed, more particularly with respect to UNEP. So do you feel that you can say that to us in a few minutes, or do you want maybe to take it later?
No, I'll just say one minute, and then we could discuss later, because UNEP, the UN Environment Program, is the core institution for the global environment, what I call the anchor institution for the global environment, that was also created in the 1970s, in 1972. And for environmental multilateralism to work, we need two things. We need effective institutions, and we need leadership. And I would say we need leadership from small states. And so we could come back to this toward the end, but I would recommend, I know you have various links to things that all of us here on the panel have written. I just published a book on UNEP, the UN Environment Program at 50. And just one last thing, it was derogatorily referred to in the 1970s by its peer institutions, the other multilateral agencies, because of the acronym UNEP, UNEP, as not the United Nations Environment Program, but as the United Nations Everything Program. And I think what needs to be done is that UNEP has to proudly be and become the United Nations Everything Program, because the environment is everything.
Very clear, very much to the point. So I will move now to Suzanne. And Suzanne, I guess I would like to start by asking you a bit your postdoc reflection on Germany's UN Security Council period, particularly with respect to the priorities that it had set itself for 2019-20. And how do you assess whatever was achieved, or whether those were the right priorities, or whether they should have been different, you know, with this double focus on climate and security? Or mute, Suzanne. Suzanne, you're mute. Ah, Suzanne disappeared. Here.
I always have to reload the page, obviously, every now and then. So here we are. Yes, first and foremost, I would like to congratulate IDDRI as well to the anniversary. I mean, this is a special day. I have a son who's exactly his birthday today, so it's really hard for me, easy to remember. 20 years of IDDRI and a long, long history of cooperation. So happy to be around as well. And well, yes, the German engagement in the UN Security Council was, of course, it had a longer list of ideas, and the agenda was focusing on climate change and related security risks. And of course, Germany had engaged before that presidency already in supporting other countries to keep the debate alive, and it was aiming for it was hosting a debate during the pandemic eventually. So that made the whole program that was behind the ambitions that were behind this not unsuccessful, but it downgraded everything. And the original idea was to have a kind of product, that means a document that reestablishes and maintains the importance of discussing security implications from climate change at the UN Security Council. And that already would have been a big achievement. So that did not happen. There were several agreements for instance, Germany is financing now a special representative to the UN mission in Somalia, who is acquainted with the climate change implications for the region. And of course, there are other achievements, but mainly it was and it is still about the idea that this issue will not disappear again from the agenda in the Security Council, and this was pretty successful. Other issues, of course, were norms and rules, and also protecting human security in other respects. I don't want to go into the details here, but basically this was this engagement of the German government was embedded in its initiative for multilateralism, its so-called Alliance for Multilateralism, that has been reframed into a multilateralism for the people. And that is where the German idea about multilateralism stands in 2021. So Marie,
thank you very much.
Move a bit on.
Yes, that's fine. And I'm going to take a second question, which is quite different but I think which is quite important. One of the key frontiers today is the WTO. It seems to me, at least from where I stand in Geneva, one of the really key frontiers for the WTO is how will it integrate the environmental agenda. So how will we actually move towards a nexus of trade and climate, or environment, more generally environmental action? So can you tell us what you are thinking on this, and what you would suggest are going to be both maybe the accelerators and maybe also some of the remaining obstacles to go in that?
Yes, first, I would like to say that I enjoyed Bertrand's theory of how international relations work very much. I wonder he's still in the room, because it fits very well to what we experience in many institutions that are post-World War II institutions and are supposed to deliver on multilateral ideas. And the idea, at least in the industrial countries, about free trade, while I hear from developing countries mostly that it's about fair trade. The idea behind the WTO, that was founded in 1995 as a follow-up and a roof to the several trade agreements, the idea was really to enable everyone to participate in trade and bring down barriers and make new development rounds possible. And they totally got stuck. And I think that was already a signal of parallel developments of globalization that undermine the global or the international institution in a specific way. First and foremost, because these institutions, including the WTO, were not able to reform themselves in the light of emerging powers or economies for that matter. And so that stipulated, or that motivated these countries to set up parallel forums and to sort out their own interest in these forums, plus using the WTO and others. While your question was relating to the role of the WTO, this needs to be kept in mind, because lately we had a the US blocking the dispute settlement mechanism, which was really the major key driver of promoting trade and fairness and rule of law in this institution. Now, for climate policy implementation and also for sustainable development, both being the Sustainable Development Clause can be found all around trade agreements these days. It's mostly in the preamble, and there's a strong commitment, so lip service, to having sustainable development. This kind of situation of an overdue reform and the lack of willingness of member states to do this reform makes the WTO only a theoretical option to bring forward climate-related targets and policymaking. Because on the ground, what we see is that nations embark on climate policy. They submit to the Paris Agreement what we call nationally determined contributions, that is bottom-up determined targets or claims or adaptation needs, what have you. And of course, many of these so-called NDCs relate to trade, because trade has taken over a large part of each country's emissions balance sheet and is hinging on trade. This is confronted with a world where, for instance, the latest studies from the US researcher found that actually tariffs on renewable energy production and related products are much higher than those tariffs on fossil fuel-based products. So the whole situation is it's totally asymmetric. And so, of course, in theory, we all know that there are different ways to reform that place in that direction. And let me just mention them, because this is otherwise too frustrating, because I always talk about the reform need, which is not going to happen anytime soon. It is about the rules that are included. It is about the primary goal of keeping the global resources in place and to serving the needs of the people, just as the definition of human security by Maria. And it is about a rules-based system that has some bite. so that a reform or the idea of protecting the climate and other resources should play a larger role in the disputes that arise in these bodies at the WTO. Also, it is about a positive agenda, bringing up ideas about how countries and people that benefit from trade could get connected around the globe in a fair and transparent way, instead of treating and instead of setting up the parallel forums. So I think there's a lot to do and to discuss, and the discussions, they are taking place in many forums. I'm attending at least 3 of those forums per week right now. So interest is really high, but this needs to be brought to the attention of policymakers. And we have here in the EU the situation that the member states actually have given the mandate to the EU Commission on trade relations, while at the same time, of course, they are all engaged in climate policy making and need the support of the trade system in this respect. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm ready for questions and answers.
Thank you very much indeed, Suzanne. So, I think that I will just only make a very short summary here of the two last intervention by taking again this notion of Maria, of the E of environment that has to become the E of everything. A good summary, in fact, of what both of you have said, and how do we actually bring sustainability at the core, not as an afterthought, not as a line in the preamble, but really as a dimension at the core of our multilateral systems. And definitely the WTO will be a hard case to crack, even though I think that the current DG of the WTO is certainly convinced of at least part of that agenda, but it's certainly a value-driven need. I'm going to actually give the word now to Tibeze Ezekiel, because we finally, I think, managed to get him online. We had some technical issues before, so I don't know, Tibeze, if you hear me, and I think we should actually really take you while you're here and give you the word for a short presentation, the short keynote that we should have heard at the beginning. So please, the floor is yours.
All right. Good evening, Maria, and to everyone. I apologize for showing up late. I had a few power outages here, and so I couldn't join you on time. Yeah, so in the interest of time, I'll just share some few thoughts around the topic for conversation. So good evening to all panelists and the cherished listeners. I think that whilst the multilateral system is essential towards building synergies and promoting collaborative approach in sustainable development, some challenges actually still exist with respect to the role of civil society. And I have been in civil society space for some time now, working primarily on climate change and energy-related issues. And I realized that increasingly the space for CSO participation in the decision-making process is shrinking, which appears to be inconsistent with the leaving no one behind tagline of the Sustainable Development Goals, also known as the Agenda 2030. So that's one critical issue that I think is affecting CSOs in all this multilateral system of governance. But I must say that when it comes to Africa, or particularly indigenous people and local communities, there's still more work to be done. And I think that there are some key issues or some key areas that when they are tackled or considered, it will help, strengthen indigenous people and also build a capacity to become, if you like, to become active beneficiaries of some of these interventions from the multilateral system. One key recommendation or approach I believe that we can adopt is one, the issue of providing true commitment and not just lip service. So in all this system, multilateral system, when it comes to Africa, when it comes to people with disability, people living in poor and vulnerable community, anytime we make commitment, we must ensure that those commitments are adhered to and not just providing lip service. One clear case or one key example is the pledges we make at the international conferences. For example, when it comes to climate finance, the Global North normally have pledged, for example, $100 billion to as their contribution or as a way to tackle the climate change effect. but we're not seeing that kind of resources being, provided, for this kind of intervention. So again, we think that those commitments, those efforts, the ODAs, must commit to their pledges and support indigenous people and local communities. Again, I think that CSOs are known to be watchdogs. So their role basically is to watch, to protect, or to raise the red flags, if they need be, in terms of bad governance, in terms of bad decision-making from the political leaders. So their role should not be seen as they are being antagonistic necessarily, but they just have to flag as watchdogs. Their role is to flag, or to draw government's attention or any other party's attention to the need to ensure that we are all benefiting from the same endeavor that we are all, committing to. So again, I think that there's a need to support CSOs in that regard, strengthen them, give them the resources, the capacity building, and also importantly, the need for technology transfer, which they need to get their work done. So I think it's very important to get that done. And I think also that when it comes to CSOs and other decision makers, we need to provide them with the resources or capacity building that they need to function in attacks as CSOs. Whatever they do is very critical in the role they play. But if their space is shrinking, if their role is diminishing, then it makes it very difficult for them to be recognized in the work that they do. So I want to give just one key example to wrap up in the work that I do. I am a young CSO actor. I work, like I mentioned, on climate change and environmental issues. One of the key things I did was to fight against government's intention to build a coal plant in Ghana. It was not an easy fight because, it was my task to actually convince government to shift away from coal to renewable energy. Fortunately, based on our argument, based on our position, government heeded to our concern and has stopped the construction of the 700 supercritical coal power plant that would have been built by now in Ghana. They are now shifting towards renewable energy. So for some of these campaigns, I believe that the multilateral system should support young people like us, environmentalists, to push some of this agenda so that we can attain our development agenda without affecting or compromising on the integrity of our ecosystem. So I believe that these are some of the things we need to consider in our conversation, that as we build a multilateral system, let's not lose sight of the important role of CSOs to give them all the support they need, all the capacity they need, so they can also contribute to attaining our development agenda. And when it comes to Africa, I also want to talk about the need to ensure that the Africa Agenda 2063 is also supported, by this multilateral system to ensure that Africa gets developed and that we need energy and, of course, clean energy to also industrialize. And my final commitment or my final submission is that in the light of the global governance architecture, it's my desire, I want to make a strong case that Africa should also be considered in the G77 group so that Africa can also have a seat, can also have a say in that conversation, because all this must inure towards the leaving no one behind tagline that we are all pushing as far as it goes, SDGs are concerned. So these are just my few thoughts I want to share in terms of how the underdeveloped or the deprived communities can also be empowered to become, valuable assets in this multilateral system that we're all pursuing. Thank you very much for your attention.
Very much, Ibeze, for those very clear call, but also very clear mechanisms for inclusivity in the debates. How do we actually bring from the bottom up very concrete solutions that can, in fact, be also exemplars for the rest of the world, and how do we actually bring this into the multilateral system? So thank you very much to all the speakers for a very rich, I think, and very concrete at the same time, with kind of enlightening in terms of reflective, theoretically speaking, but also very concrete contributions. I would like now to actually give the floor to two Sciences Po students who will have some questions. I think we are going to start with Nathalie. Nathalie, I don't know whether you're here. Yes, you're here. Yes. Okay, so floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you to all our speakers. I think I have finished this session with so many more questions that I would love to hear from all of you all, but I will try to stick to the ones I have. So we have discussed during this session how existing multilateral institutions that were originally conceived in terms of balancing state power are no longer adequate to explain the dynamics of our globalized or intersocial world, how do you envision the evolution of these institutions to reflect the reality of our current globalized system and account for non-state power when addressing environmental issues? And specifically, what features or competencies do our multilateral institutions need to develop in order to engage constructively with non-state actors and civil society on environmental issues?
So who wants to jump in? Maria?
I will jump in. Thank you. Thank you, Natalie, for this great question. I was actually just starting to type something in the Q&A for Chibeze, and it was exactly this kind of question, but focused on UNEP as the multilateral institution for the environment. Because as I was listening to Chibeze and your story, Chibeze, about activism, about leadership at the local level, but with global repercussions, I was wondering, given also that you're based in Ghana, in Africa, and UNEP is headquartered in Kenya, in Africa, Africa has a voice in multilateral environmental processes. You are hosting the anchor institution for the global environment. And I was wondering, exactly like Natalie was saying, what role, what features, and what competencies in your mind should UNEP have? But Natalie, I can respond to that from where I sit and where I stand. And I've been working with UNEP for many, many years, since the late 1990s. And I have been saying over and over again, in a sense, that UNEP, but also the United Nations more broadly, need to work better with academia. I think this is a missing link. There is the civil society, the non-governmental organizations, absolutely. And there are various ways that the United Nations works with them. There is business, and the United Nations works with business in more and more systematic ways. And yet, academia is absent. The knowledge sector is not a constituency that these various institutions work with. And so I would like to see academic institutions engage more, because they represent youth, but they represent thinking, they represent innovation. And in academia, we have faculty that are grounded for many, many years, many decades, and yet our students come in and out, and they become business people, they become government people, leaders, followers. All of the kind of vibrancy that we see are the people in our classrooms that then graduate and move on further. So I would like to see mechanisms and features within the United Nations, environment and others, that integrate and make it possible for the knowledge sector to really become a powerful and effective new actor.
Maria, Natalie, are you happy with this answer?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. So I will turn to Charlotte, if Charlotte is here. I don't see her on my screen. Yes, here she comes. Okay, Charlotte.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for your contribution. This is very linked to what has just been answered by Maria Ivanova. So if we look at all of your thinkings and your theories, we can see that it's been a long time that that there has been ideas of how to change our international governance in order to include sustainability. So now we were wondering what prevents us from moving from talk to action. If it's for instance, a necessary change in values, or also as Bertrand Badier said, if traditional powers are supposedly powerless today, how come that these traditional powers still are the ruling powers today? And so what challenges still exist, and at which stage of the process to move towards a new environmental global governance do you think that we are?
Wants to take this question? No volunteers? Oh, Emel, yes.
Thank you very much for this question. First of all, I think developing countries lack sufficient resources. For example, when I look at Turkish case, Turkey has not been approved the Paris Agreement for the last 5 years. And it has been a very recent move. We have seen a very recent move coming from the current government. During the last few weeks, Turkey decided to approve the Paris Agreement. Because we have been debating this move for the last 2 years and for the last perhaps 3 years. Why Turkey did not sign but did not approve the agreement? An issue of money. So I think the most important thing regarding this is if I see this as an obstacle to further develop environmental governance in the global south or in the developing world, it is about the lack of sources. So I think this is also this is one of the most important obstacles of the developing world. And also in some developing countries, although there exist non-state actors who are active on the ground, I'm talking about environmental governance, of course. There are climate organizations, but the rise of authoritarianism in full international society, in the world politics, and also as you can imagine, it is not always possible in the developing world to go to the ground and to make a reaction to the governmental policy, to the policies of the government, and to criticize their environment policies, because I understand how Bertrand Badier conceptualized global politics, global security as a different form of security in the current international order. But in some context, in some local context, it is still the case. National security still matters. And also climate can also be seen as a security problem in some national contexts. In some authoritarian countries, for example, climate actions or climate activities can be seen as terrorist. So it is still the case we have been witnessing, for example, in my own country. So there are some domestic obstacles. There are some obstacles related with financial resources, and also domestic politics still matters. Leadership is very important. So the combination of all these factors, I think, explain why there is still, we don't still have a common ground, or we don't still go further in having in efficient environmental governance.
Much, Emel. So I can maybe read a few questions from the chat. We have a number of questions. I'll read a few. Maybe I'll take a few, at the same time. Keep them in mind, panelists, and then you can choose which one you want to focus on. So one question, which actually, in a sense, resonates a bit with some of my introduction, is: don't you think that real implementation of the 2030 agenda and its SDGs could be a lever to really renew multilateralism in order to face global and local challenges? So this notion that maybe, instead of reinventing the wheel, walking the talk and bringing SDGs at the core, whatever that means. And obviously this is, a major probably institutional and organizational transformation through this paradigm shift could be one way to go. There's a question by Maria for Shibeze, who is where she says that she would certainly appreciate it if Shibeze could say what would be the most critical role for UNEP in supporting activists like you, Shibeze. And let me see if there's another last question that I can maybe bring. Those are more comments. I guess so questions really, a lot of questions focus on UNEP. I'll take this last one. How could UNEP be really effective if most of the key issues for the environment are addressed in or led by other institutions? Would that mean actually not UNEP everything, but the end of UNEP in a sense? So those are the three questions that I would select. And I guess I'll give first the word to Shibeze to answer Maria, and maybe Maria to answer some of the questions on UNEP.
All right, and thank you, Marie. Yeah, so how can UNEP support activists like myself? Well, I think that there's some challenge when it even comes to the UN system, from my own observation, that even among the UN agencies, there's some, even the issue of coordination is still a challenge in Ghana, for example. So in Ghana, we hardly work with UNEP, but we are very active with UNDP Ghana, and also in recent times, UNICEF. UNICEF is supporting young people towards the pre-COP 26 and also the COP26 workshop or conference itself. But we don't see UNEP, within all these discussions, all these conversations. Perhaps UNEP may be very strong in Kenya, but not so active in Ghana for reasons I don't know. But I think that it should be, if you like, I would say that it can be a starting point to start engaging them, at the national level to see what kind of support that they can bring to bear. Because my understanding is that when it comes to environmental issues, UNEP should be seen to be very active and very strong. But here we see UNDP doing that in Ghana. We see UNICEF doing that in Ghana. But in all these conversations, we don't find UNEP, presenting or representing very strongly. I personally am willing to take this up and try to reach out to UNEP in Ghana to see how we can collaborate, for them to support other young activists, to also pursue environmental action. After all, we are all trying to pursue a common agenda and a common goal. So I think it differs from country's context. But in my case, I wouldn't mind reaching out to UNEP in Ghana to see how we can also bring them to the limelight and then see how we can work collaboratively to achieve our common agenda. So basically, that'll be my response to that. And so if, I think this is Maria, if anybody, for example, has a UNEP contact in Ghana, I'll be happy, to get that contact and or possibly reach them through UNDP or UNICEF to see how we can also get them on board to give them some visibility in terms of the role they're supposed to play in Ghana as far as environmental issues are concerned. So that would be my response to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe Maria, your turn.
Wonderful, and Shibeze, thank you very much. I would love to follow up and connect with you. There is a regional office for Africa that is also based at the headquarters in Kenya, and that regional office works throughout Africa. So I would be very happy to connect with you and indeed work on exactly the issues that the questioner asked me. How can UNEP be effective if most key issues for environment are addressed by other institutions? In a sense, Shibeze, you started answering that. You were saying, oh, UNDP is working here and UNICEF is working. And yes, where is UNEP? So Marie-Laure, I really don't like the end of UNEP as a statement, the end of everything. No, how can we rethink that? And my answer to this is actually by going back to the original vision. This is what I did during my graduate studies. I started on this journey actually arguing for the creation of a global environmental organization because I thought, oh, we don't have one. much like the questioner is asking. If all of these other institutions are doing it and we don't have a strong global environmental organization, how can we be effective on environment? And then when I went into the archives and figured out the original vision for UNEP, I discovered that it was created as a nimble, catalytic, small cooperative institution, exactly because there were so many others that already existed. I mean, the International Labour Organization was created in 1919 as a specialized agency. You're not going to create a separate one when labor issues are social issues, are environmental issues. The key was, how do we figure out what we need to do internationally to make these existing institutions actually do the right thing for the environment? And I still think that that is the task for UNEP. That is the task for all of us, is to figure out how to work with all of these other actors that exist, whose partial responsibility, mandate, drive, enthusiasm is about the environment. And so being collaborative it will be absolutely key. And so I'll just say three things. UNEP needs to be a connector. It has to connect the dots through formal partnerships, through informal partnerships. It needs to be the connecting tissue among those institutions. Secondly, it has to regain its authority in being the scientific voice of saying, here's what's happening on the environment, connecting maybe through AI, maybe through new ways of bringing science together, of saying these are the key issues on the environment. And thirdly, of being the space where various influencers and institutions come to consult and to collaborate. And the UN Environment Assembly was supposed to be that space. And so I think we just need to work to make it that space, so that people, countries, institutions, individuals, leaders, followers would go to that space and want to share their experiences and learn from others.
Maria, does Suzanne or Emel want to have a last word? Since Bertrand Badier had to leave us, so it's only the two of you left, apart from Maria. Any last word, or you're fine? Suzanne, yes?
Yeah, no, thanks. I wanted to say that it was very interesting to hear both sides, so concrete proposals for institutions like UNEP, plus the overall idea how the international system needs to be brought up to speed. And I think there's much more to discuss, but not today, obviously. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And Emel, do you want to maybe...
Thank you very much. It is very inspiring. And I also like very much Maria's presentation. She talked about environment conventional index. I heard about it. I think I saw it on Twitter last week, or I don't know, perhaps 2 weeks ago. And I think it is something which looks like this University of Toronto. I think there is a sample of G20 in the University of Toronto. I think they also prepare index for analyzing the commitments of member states to certain issue areas. I think this is something which is made specifically for environmental commitment states. I learned about it, so thank you very much. It's so inspiring, and I also think that it is very important to create this kind of index and to make climate policies mainstreaming topics. I think it is very important for the development work, because development work is own agenda. In some countries, climate is not at the top of their agenda because they have lots of domestic problems, economic problems, and other security problems. So I think climate policy and climate governance must be mainstreaming topics. So organizing this kind of debate around tables and conferences in climate governance, and try to link climate governance to multilateralism and foreign policy related topics is very important. For example, I wrote an article last year on sustainable foreign policy, I think it will be published in a journal, in next journal next year. In this paper, I discussed how countries should link their foreign policy agenda to their sustainable development agenda. So I think this is also relevant for climate policy, foreign policy, climate policy, security policy, this kind of topics. If we continue this kind of topics in academic conferences, these topics will be mainstream, and it will also help where public opinion understand the content and understand the importance of these issues in the upcoming years.
Thank you very much, Emel. A big thank you to all four of you, Emel, Suzanne, Maria, and Bertrand, who has left. A big thank you, obviously, to Shibeze also, who I think also already left. A huge thank you to all of you for still being with us, still 42 people connected. So thank you to the team, to Karine and to Lola and to everybody at IDDRI. Big happy birthday, guys. It's great. Very happy to have been with you tonight. And I don't know if I need to give the mic to somebody else or if that's the end. So whatever. If somebody wants to jump in, please let them do that. Otherwise, I guess I wish you a very nice and good day for those of you from the UK.
Thank you very much.